Hello, welcome to Northfield Medical's Using the Preventing Damage to Rigid Endoscopes Audit Tool. My name is Michael Matthews and I'm the Director for Clinical Education and Training at Northfield Medical. Today's objectives are to explain the need for the auditing process. We're going to identify common sources of preventable damage to rigid endoscopes. We're going to describe best practices for preventing damage to rigid endoscopes. And we're going to suggest a strategy for developing an ongoing quality improvement program to prevent damage and lower those repair costs. First off, let's look at why we should audit in the first place. AAMI, or the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation's ST79, states that performance measures for problem investigation should include, among other things, instrument and equipment damage or failure. In other words, we need to be actively measuring how well we're doing at preventing damage to our devices. Now keep in mind that the average cost of a scope repair is around $600. Now that may not seem like a lot when you start thinking about flexible endoscopes, for example, but think about how many rigid scopes that you have. It really starts to add up over time. So auditing is an important tool for being able to monitor how you're performing and then identify where the failures are and create targeted solutions for those. Otherwise, you end up just running around from failure to failure with no idea of how it actually happened. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of particularly SPD managers feel like they're doing all the time, is just running around putting out fires. Now, in order to help facilitate this process, Northfield Medical has developed some process audit tools that will help you follow a single endoscope through its reprocessing cycle to help you identify where those failures are taking place. And that's the purpose of this webinar, is to train you on what you're looking for throughout that process so that you know what the audit tool is talking about. Now, first off, we're going to start in the OR setup. We want to make sure that the scope is removed from that protective container with two hands, applying even pressure to both ends of the retention clips. Now, we see this mistake frequently from surgical technologists, especially when they're in a hurry, maybe for an emergency case, where they'll reach in and they'll grab the scope in the middle with one hand and pull up. And what happens when you do that is those retention clips that are designed to hold the scope in place, they pull back against that pressure in the center. Well, inside that scope is rod lenses that are made of glass, and there's anchor points that are holding those rod lenses in place. And that pressure causes the scope to flex just a little bit, which can cause those anchors to break or that glass to break, and it can do a lot of damage over time. So we want to make sure that the scopes are being picked up with two hands, applying even pressure where those retention clips are in place. Now, there's a couple of caveats that we have to talk about. First off, notice in the picture that this particular holder has the retention clips that apply pressure to the scope at the eyepiece and in the middle of the shaft. And that one that's down towards the distal tip is actually a little bit larger because it's designed to hold another eyepiece. So this is a very common design for a rigid endoscope container, because essentially what it does is it allows you to put the scope in either direction. And when that is the case, it's very important to notice that the retention clips that actually apply pressure to hold the scope in place, that's where you want to pick the scope up. And this also assumes that you're using those protective containers in the first place. If you have any scopes that are not being securely placed into a container during its transportation and storage phase, I guarantee you're going to have a lot more damage to your rigid scopes. Next, during the OR setup, we really want to make sure that that OR staff is both visually inspecting and function testing that scope prior to the physician and the patient entering the room. And it's really easy to just very quickly check for image quality to make sure that it's bright and clear. And remember that the goal is always to find the problems before they affect the surgeon and a patient. One thing we've talked about frequently is how even in a best case scenario, when there's a surgical site failure of a device and all they have to do is stop and go get a new scope or a new device, that still adds time to the surgery, that still adds stress to the room. And we want to prevent that as much as possible. So any time that we can catch a problem with the device before the physician and the patient get into the room, that is our goal. Now, during the procedure, we always want to make note of any functionality or performance issues that are noted during the procedure, and usually it's the surgeon that's going to catch these. They might complain about it being dark, blurry, or maybe even an incomplete image. So in this particular instance, we would consider this a failure to catch the issue earlier, but sometimes the surgeons do notice things that only could be noticed during the procedure. So keep that in mind and make note of that anytime something like that comes up. Now, we also want to be watching the surgeon's technique in how they use and handle the device. Surgeons very often will use the scope as a pry bar for kind of moving organs around or probing in an area. Maybe they'll over torque the scope, or what we very frequently see is pulling that scope through the cannula at an angle. Now, it's very important to realize that surgeons don't often receive much, if any, training on damage prevention strategies for these devices, and so they probably have some bad habits that they've developed throughout school and simply aren't aware of the damage that can be done to these devices. They aren't aware of how fragile they are. The nice thing about the audit tool is that it allows you to passively document when you see these things happening, because when you observe them during a procedure, that's really not the time you want to bring it up. You definitely don't want to try and correct the physician's technique while he's operating on a patient. So definitely make a note of it, and that allows you to then have that conversation maybe at a later point, or perhaps with an administrator who can then bring it up to the physician. Now, the next thing we want to focus on is pre-cleaning, and keep in mind that pre-cleaning does include during the procedure, not just after. And the main detail is we want to make sure that gross soil, so heavy bioburden, is not being allowed to dry on the scope. We also want to see the use of a pre-soak after the procedure, and we want to make sure that saline is not being allowed to sit on the scope. Now, keep in mind that stainless steel, while it is very strong, has one critical weakness, and that critical weakness is the effect of chloride ions that are present in particularly saline, but are also present in blood as well. And those chloride ions will eat the protective layer of chromium oxide that sits on top of those stainless steel sheaths. It will also do a lot of damage to the glass on the lenses as well. So really want to make sure that both blood and saline are not allowed to sit on the scope for long periods of time. It will do a lot of damage. We also want to make sure that the scopes are being placed back into their proper containers prior to transport, and keep in mind to continue to use even pressure applied to both ends of the scope at those retention clips, just exactly like we talked about at the very beginning, that if we are pressing down just in the middle, it's going to cause that flexion in that shaft, and that's how those glass rods get broken. Now, keep in mind also that if you are not using a container to transport your scopes back to decontam, that's a lot of damage that can occur during that phase. Your case carts, remember, don't have shocks on them, so every single bump in the floor, every single bump against the wall, all that shock damage gets transferred through that cart into the scope itself, and so a lot of damage can occur if you're not using those containers for your scopes during transport. Now, during the decontamination process, we want to make sure the scope is removed and placed to be processed with the delicate items. We want to make sure the scopes are being cleaned, disinfected, rinsed, and dried separately, one at a time. If you do a bunch at a time, there's just a lot of opportunity to not rinse them properly. There's opportunity to bang them against one another. It's just a very bad process and a lot of risk for damage, especially, if you go into your decontam and you see stuff like that, you can see buried underneath those containers and those cords. They're scopes and they're in their proper containers, but there's still stuff sitting on top of them. And so it just doesn't take a lot of weight to cause that flexion in the scope that, of course, will put that pressure on the anchors, on the glass rods themselves, and causes them to crack and break over time. Now, after the scopes move out of decontam and into the prep and pack side, we want to put a lot of emphasis on the inspection process. This is critical for making sure that those devices that are faulty do not make it into a surgeon's hand and therefore affect that procedure. So we want to inspect the image, we want to inspect the light output. Inspecting the light output is very easy. It can be done every single time, very simply just by pointing the distal tip up towards a light. You can even use like a small flashlight for this if you want. But when you point the distal tip towards a light source, it's going to cause the light post to light up. And everywhere where you see a dark spot, that is a broken fiber. Now, there are more fibers than what are needed in a scope, and so you've got a little bit of margin for error. But typically our guidance is that if you've got dark spots in greater than 30% of the surface area, then that means that device needs to go out for repair. So again, if this is not part of your regular inspection process, it's going to allow scopes that don't have proper lighting to make it into the surgeon's hands. And again, that's going to affect that procedure. Now, next in the inspection process, we want to inspect that shaft to make sure that there's no bending and there's no dents. We also want to inspect the eyepiece to make sure that it's secure and there's no cracks. And we want to inspect the distal tip to make sure that there's no physical damage. Now, inspecting the straightness of the shaft is very easy. You can just use a ruler or your desk, just anything that has a nice straight edge. And anywhere you see that shaft kind of separating from that straight edge, that's a good indication that that scope has been mishandled in some way, and there's probably some potential damage that is beginning to occur. And then, of course, when you inspect the distal tip, always make sure that you're using some form of lighted magnification so that you can see very subtle damage. Of course, in this picture, that damage is not subtle at all. If that isn't removed from your stock immediately and sent out for repair, you do not want this being put back into the hands of a surgeon. So the inspection process is all about identifying these early warning signs so that they don't go through the rest of the process and then affect that patient. Now, during the assembly process, again, we go back to those protective sheaths. We want to make sure that the scopes are being placed in the protective sheaths and that they're being locked in correctly. Again, even pressure, both ends of the scope. Just like we talked about in the previous sections, where anywhere that scope is being held physically into place, that's where you want to evenly apply the pressure to both pull it out and put it back into that container. And then, of course, for sterilization, you always want to make sure that you're using the proper sterilization methods, and that'll all be outlined for you in those OEM IFUs. And of course, you want to make sure that the correct cycles are being used. IUSS, or immediate use steam sterilization, is particularly harsh on scopes because they have so many different materials that are tightly fit in together, including glass and metal. Those material types heat up and cool down at different rates. And so if you use IUSS, which is a very rapid heat up and cool down process, or your scopes are kind of being used as rapid turnover items, and so they're being taken while warm directly out of an autoclave into a very cool OR, that's going to cause those pieces to begin to separate from one another. And you'll begin to see stuff like this where water spots are starting to accumulate inside of the scope, even though there may not be a huge amount of physical damage that's just really obvious. And what's happening here is the glass portion of the scope is beginning to pull away from the rigid stainless steel portion of the scope. And that's allowing water vapor to accumulate inside the scope, where hard water mineralization is beginning to build up, and that creates a very foggy image. It may be very difficult to think of an instance of IUSS or even rapid turnover to be considered a process failure because the OR got what they needed, and so they may not be complaining about it. They're happy as long as they have a scope for their procedure. But this has to be considered a process failure because it's something that's going to lead to damage in the future. And an important piece of this conversation has to do with the question of, do you have enough scopes for the number of procedures that you're doing? And a good indicator on that question is, how often are you having to rapidly turn over scopes? If you find that there are scopes that you are having to turn over frequently, that's an indication that you might need to get some more scopes. Now, I know that this is very counterintuitive, especially for a lot of administrators, to think that you can actually save money by spending more on your inventory. But if you don't have enough scope, you're going to hurry during the reprocessing. And if you're moving warm scopes into a cold OR and then into a warm body, that's going to lead to this exact type of damage. So now that we've gone through how to use the audit tool to evaluate your process, let's talk about how to initiate a process improvement project. Now, the first thing that you want to do is you want to talk to your repair company to get a baseline for how much you are currently spending on your rigid scope repairs. Next, you need to determine how many procedures are being performed at your facility that use rigid scopes in an average day or week. If you're at a very large, busy facility, it may be easier to think about it in terms of procedures per day. Whereas if you're at an average size facility or a smaller facility, it may be easier to think about it in terms of average procedures per week. Next, you want to choose sort of a representative mix of cases and surgeons that you want to audit. It's going to help you get an idea of where the flaws in the process are occurring if you're observing a lot of different types of cases and a lot of different surgeons. Now, the process improvement method that we're going to suggest is a very simplified version of the Six Sigma method. Now, in general, Six Sigma principles are designed to monitor a process and then determine how many defective processes occur. So maybe a better way to think about this is imagine a perfect process, which means that at no point in any of the things that we've discussed are there any deviations, meaning any mistakes that anybody has made that would cause a device to be damaged. So if we think about it in terms of a perfect process, we can now think about, okay, how many times is something occurring that causes a process to not be perfect? And we would call that a defective process. So for example, if we do audits and we determine that out of every 10 procedures, 3 of them has some form of care and handling failure, you've got a 30% defect rate. Again, we can use that as an example, but more than likely your number is going to be significantly higher than that. Now, once we have determined our defect rate, we can kind of look at the common areas of failure and create targeted solutions. You are going to want to focus on just a few at a time, and the ones that you want to focus on are the most common and the ones that you have the most likelihood of being able to fix. It's very difficult to try and create a solution for, 10 different problems at once. It just becomes too much. You're much better off to focus on just a couple, maybe 1 or 2, 3 at the most. The targeted solutions you choose to utilize may be something as simple as an in-service or some very targeted education. It might be making a purchase of something, say, some new containers that have better retention clips, or it might be something completely new, maybe changing a process entirely. Now, as you come up with these very targeted solutions, it's very important to test them because not everything may work as well as what you want. So you have to be very careful to measure your progress, but as you're measuring your progress, report your successes back to your administrators because it's that measurable success that administrators love so much. And of course, keep in mind that anytime you are working with administrators, you want to try and use dollar figures as much as possible. Those administrators and those decision makers want to know the financial value of what you've been doing. So let's work through an example. First, let's consider that we may have a baseline defect rate of 30%, just like we talked about earlier. Now, if you talk to your repair company and your repair company tells you that your spend last year was $50,000, you know that 30% failure rate is resulting in $50,000 of spend. Now, let's say that your evaluation process has determined a couple of really important ways that you can improve, and you implement those things and then re-audit again and find that your new defect rate is only 10%. That would be a massive improvement. You know that if 30% failure results in $50,000, then a 10% failure rate is going to result in around $16,000 of repair cost. Now, that's a $34,000 improvement, and that's massive. So let's think about what could you do with $34,000? Well, you could buy 5 small diameter flexible scopes. You could buy 2 large diameter flexible scopes. You could buy 22 rigid laparoscopes, 14 power tools, 10 video cameras, or if you're feeling hungry and you're tired of pizza parties, you can buy 9,214 Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supremes. Keep in mind, all these prices are based on certified pre-owned equipment, except for the Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supremes, obviously. So in conclusion, most damage to devices occur as part of its use in procedures and the reprocessing cycle. Now, regular auditing is a critical tool that can help you identify where specifically that damage is happening. Now, once you identify where that damage is happening, you can implement a process improvement project that will have demonstrable return on investment value. And that's that ROI that administrators love to hear about. And the money that you save on preventable damage can be reinvested into a number of improvements that are needed for your department. And you can receive copies of these audit tools upon request from Northfield Medical. We have them for rigid scopes, flexible scopes, power equipment, and video cameras. They're reproducible and totally free, and they will help guide you through determining where that preventable damage is happening. Thank you.